Several people have asked how to make binding or how to attach it and get it to look nice. So I thought I would make you a quick tutorial of how to do that. You're going to start out by cutting strips 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 inches wide. It's up to you. I prefer 2 1/4 because I prefer a nice narrow binding on my quilt that is very full. You need to sew these together on the diagonal. I'm going to show you how to do it. If you start by placing your first strip horizontally and then place your next strip vertically, right sides together, and stitch along the diagonal, you will get that mitered look that is desired in binding. If you stitch it with one strip vertically and one strip horizontally, making that L, and you stitch it on the diagonal, you get that mitered look that is so desired in binding. So I have my strips placed. I have one going vertically, one going horizontally. They make a letter L, a backwards letter L. And I'm going to just stitch them on the diagonal. You can mark your diagonal if you need to. It's just as simple as grabbing a straight edge and putting it in place and just drawing yourself a line with a pencil. I've done so many of these, I can pretty much stitch it by eyeball, but it's up to you. If you think you need to mark that, feel free. And we're just going to stitch that diagonal line. And we end up with this nice diagonal seam. I probably could have done a better job of lining up my stripes there, and if it was a show quilt I would have, but just to show you, I just thought I'd show you how to stitch that. In order to make it look nice on the back, you're going to trim this to about a 1/2 inch. And you would take this to the ironing board and press these open. And usually we don't like to press our seams open, but in this case we're going to, because it will give us a nice flat binding. Then you will fold this in half lengthways and iron the entire long strip. You may have several hundred inches in order to have enough to figure to go around your entire quilt. We are going to do binding on a quilt, and I need you to cut your strips 2 1/4 inches, and then you need to press that lengthwise, the entire length of the strip. We're going to attach our binding to our quilt, and we are going to start not at the corner, but about halfway down one edge of our quilt. We're going to leave about an 8 or 10 inch tail before we start stitching. And this is some binding I made a long time ago, so it's got some threads on it, but it will be okay. We are going to use our 1/4 inch seam, and we are going to sew the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the quilt. Because we are sewing this with a 1/4 inch seam, we want to stop sewing about 1/4 of an inch before we get to the corner. And we need to just put a little mark there to remind ourselves to stop sewing right there. When you get to that corner, pick up your presser foot, rotate 45 degrees, and put your presser foot down. Stitch right off the corner of your quilt. And this is what that looks like. To turn the corner, you're going to fold. Sorry about all the strings. You're going to fold right along that 45-degree line that you just stitched. Finger press that in place. Fold the remaining binding so that the raw edge of the quilt and the folded edge of the binding are aligned. Start stitching off of the edge of the quilt and travel down with that 1/4 inch seam all the way to your next corner. Again, I need to stop 1/4 inch before I get to the point or the corner. So I drew a little mark. I'm going to keep lifting this up and looking for that little mark. I need to go a few more stitches here. And one more. All right, I'm going to lift up the presser foot, rotate that 45 degrees, and sew right off of the corner, sewing straight off the corner of my quilt. Cut the thread, turn the quilt, and again, fold on that 45-degree line, finger press that in place, fold the remaining binding straight down. The top edge should be exactly aligned with the straight line of your quilt edge. We're going to be stitching off of the edge of the quilt, and we're going to stitch onto the quilt and down that 1/4 inch. We're going to continue that until we've turned all of the corners. Okay, I am back on the side where I started. Here is my beginning thread tail, and then I have this big, long, gigantic ending thread tail. I'm ready to join these because I created mitered strips or mitered seams when I pieced my binding. I want to be sure that this is also a mitered strip or mitered seam. So I need to cut everything exactly the right size. So I'm going to take just a tail end. I have plenty at the end, and I'm going to cut this because this will tell me how wide I need to make this. Okay, this is my beginning. I'm going to cut a piece off of it just to make it where I want it to lay, where I want my seam to be. I'm going to take this little piece that I just cut, which shows me the width of my binding. I'm going to lay it here, and I'm going to cut my top piece, whatever that width is. That will give me the perfect length of binding. So these are our two pieces that we will be joining. Okay, I'm going to take my top piece. Without twisting it or anything, I'm going to push it to the side and open it its full width. I'm going to take the other piece, which will attach to it, and I'll have to do some bunching and squishing of my quilt at this point to get me some slack. I'm going to take this other piece. I'm going to put the raw edge against the cut edge of the other one. I'm going to open it up. So that my two pieces butt together. Hope you can see that. I'm going to put a pin in it. And I am going to stitch it on the diagonal. And you are going to stitch right down the diagonal here. So get it lined up along your raw edge. Place it under your presser foot. Get your first few stitches in. That will help hold things in place. Remove your pin, and then you can force this flatter if you need it to be. And you can stitch right along that diagonal. So after you have formed that new seam, you just stitch this down into. Okay, you can see that I have stitched up to my corner, and I'm getting ready to turn that corner. So I want to go all the way to the corner with my needle. I'm going to pull my needle up, ouch, and stab myself in the process. And then I'm going to fold this 45-degree angle and finger press it. You can't see, but I'm going to finger press that. Try to get it good and smushed down. Then I am going to lay my needle here to keep this straight. And I'm going to fold this over. And that will allow my little points to match. I'm going to begin sewing from that point. So I'm going to put my needle up through the binding. And I'm doing this so you can see the stitches. I would not normally make them this sloppy, but I want you to see. I'm going to go back into the other binding corner. Okay, I've pulled the needle up through that piece of binding. I'm going to go back through the bottom binding and into the top binding, right all in this corner. Everything's taking place right in this little corner. And I'm going to pull this tight. And again, I would not make such a huge stitch, but I want you to see how to do that. And then I would just continue sewing right alongside my 1/4 inch piecing seam. So let me put just a few stitches in here so you can see how to do that. And I want to show you what that corner looks like after we do that. And again, I'm kind of just sticking some stitches in here. Okay, so this is what your corner looks like on the back, and this is what your corner looks like on the front. You have no stitches from the binding visible on the front, and your back should be very nice and neat and tidy. And you do that all the way around, and then you're finished, and you have a beautiful binding on your quilt. This is the back of my quilt. You can see that the binding is going to look pretty nice on the back of my quilt. Here's the whole quilt if you wanted to see it. This is the back of it. So here's the whole thing if you wanted to see it. It's just a little hand-dyed mandala. And then this will be the front. This will be the front, and you can see that that binding is going to look really nice with this wild looking quilt. I hope that helps you learn how to do your binding. If you need help, let me know. Send me an email. Drop me a line on Facebook. Give me a call if you have my number. And we will get you set up so that you can do your binding. Next, I'll do a tutorial for adding piping to your binding. Next, I will do a tutorial for adding piping to your binding, as I did on this show quilt. And here is our closure and opening on our binding. You can see that it has the same mitered seam that all of your other binding seams have. And it just looks like the rest of the binding. Okay, let me show you how we turn this binding to create a nice edge on our quilt. This was the front of our quilt where we attached our binding, and this is the back of our quilt, and we need to turn the binding to the back. We're going to flip it over, and we're going to be stitching right along that raw edge. Now, if you are having a hard time holding it in place, you can use these little clips. They're great, okay? You can order a whole box of them off of Amazon for like $5, but it will hold that in place. I'm using just a regular quilter sewing needle and just regular Coats & Clark brand thread. I need to begin by getting my thread to the top side, and I want to insert between the backing and the quilt front in the edge, and I'm going to pull that up. And if you are worried about your needle coming loose, or what I would recommend is just go ahead and loop back around and come up again almost in that same location, and that way your thread is good and secure. So you fold your binding towards your quilt back. And when I sewed this, I purposefully used green as our bobbin so that you would be able to see this, because I need you to know where to put your stitches. So you're going to travel over to wherever that first bobbin thread line is, and that was my green line. That's where I want to start. I'm going to fold over my binding. I want to catch just the tiniest edge of my binding and pull it closed. For my next stitch, I want to insert into the quilt backing through the batting, come up, just, you can see I'm just on the inside of those green lines, and come through the tiniest little edge of my binding again and pull that in place. And do that again. I'll do a few more stitches for you through the backing and the binding, never through the quilt front, and come up between and catch just the tiniest edge of your binding and pull that tight. A few more here. And you can see every time I'm coming up toward the inside of the quilt from that bobbins thread, so I can make sure. Okay, and then I'm catching just the tiniest edge of the binding, and I'm only taking about an 1/8 inch stitches. They're very, very close together. I've just got it way magnified so you can see. And you can see that we get a nice bobbin edge. Our stitches are not visible. I'm going to stitch out here to the corner so that I can show you how to turn the corner. Okay, I have reached my corner, and I now need to turn the corner, and I want to get that nice 45-degree miter on the back of the quilt like I did on the front of the quilt. So I am going to stitch right out to where the bobbin thread line is, and I'm going to stop. I'm going to finger press this 45-degree angle. I can then lay my needle here to keep that straight and pull down. And where they meet, I get this nice 45-degree angle, just like I have on the front. So I can stitch that by coming up through my folded over edge and then back down through all the layers and into the quilt backing. I'm trying to do this left-handed and backwards and it's not working. So that's what my stitched corner would look like on the back. You can see my stitch because I'm trying to do it backwards. And then you can just continue stitching right down the side of your quilt and you get that nice miter on the front and on the back of your binding. You do that all the way around and your binding will be finished. This will be the front, and you can see that that binding is going to look really nice with this wild looking quilt. I hope that helps you learn how to do your binding. If you need help, let me know. Send me an email. Drop me a line on Facebook. Give me a call if you have my number. And we will get you set up so that you can do your binding. Next, I'll do a tutorial for adding piping to your binding.